The wind at Cedar Creek had a way of getting under a man's coat and settling deep in his bones. It was a late autumn wind, born in the high, lonely places of the mountains and carrying the first real threat of winter. It scoured the golden plains, turning the tall grass into a rustling, whispering sea that broke against the foot of the station platform. Samuel Granger stood with his collar turned up, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He hated this wind. It was the same wind that had blown 3 years ago, the day he buried his wife, Sarah, and their little boy, Daniel. It felt like the world's own grief, a sound with no beginning and no end. He checked his pocket watch for the 4th time. The 3 o'clock train was late, which was nothing new. But today the delay felt like a personal affront. He should have been mending the fence line by the north pasture, not standing here waiting for a woman he never sent for. When Margaret's letter had arrived 2 days ago, carried by a neighbor from town, his first reaction was a cold, quiet rage. His older sister, with her well-meaning heart and her complete inability to leave a wound to heal on its own, had taken it upon herself to answer a mail-order bride advertisement in his name, a seamstress from Boston. She'd written, young, respectable, and looking for a new start. What Margaret had failed to understand was that Samuel Granger was not looking for a new start. He was looking to be left alone with the starts he had already had, and the endings that had followed. A long, mournful whistle cut through the wind. The train, a black iron beast trailing a plume of smoke, was finally rounding the bend. Samuel's jaw tightened. His plan was simple. He would meet this woman, explain the misunderstanding in plain terms, and pay her fare back to Boston. It was a cruel thing to do. He knew that, to let a woman travel 2,000 miles on a false hope. But it was kinder than letting her into a house that was no longer a home, but a monument. The train hissed to a stop, its great wheels groaning. A few dusty-looking men in traveling clothes got off, followed by a family with 3 loud children who immediately began to chase each other around the luggage cart. Samuel scanned the remaining passengers descending the steps. Then he saw her. She was not what he had expected. He had pictured someone hardier, perhaps, or someone more obviously desperate. This woman was slight, with a straightness to her back that seemed to cost her some effort. Her traveling dress, a dark wool, was neat but worn thin at the cuffs. A small, battered hat was pinned to her dark hair, which was pulled back in a simple knot. She clutched a single worn valise as if it were the only solid thing in the world. She paused at the bottom of the steps, her gaze sweeping over the small, wind-swept platform, the dusty cluster of buildings that made up Cedar Creek, and the vast, empty land beyond. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite fear, but a deep, unnerving uncertainty. She saw him watching her, and her chin lifted a fraction. She walked toward him, her steps measured. Mr. Samuel Granger. Her voice was lower than he'd imagined, and it held the clipped, precise sound of the East. He took his hands from his pockets and removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that felt stiff and unnatural. "Yes, ma'am. I am Samuel Granger." A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "I am Eliza Marlowe. It is a relief to finally be here." He could not return the smile. He had to do this quickly, like pulling a tooth. "Miss Marlowe, there has been a grave misunderstanding. I am afraid you have come all this way for nothing." The smile vanished. Her face, already pale from travel, seemed to lose another shade of color. "I do not understand. Your letter was very clear." "It was not my letter," he said, his voice flat. He saw the confusion in her eyes harden into disbelief. "My sister, Margaret, took it upon herself to write to you." She meant well, but she had no right. "I did not send for a wife." Eliza Marlowe stood perfectly still. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her cheek, but she did not seem to notice. She looked from his face to the letter she had pulled from her reticule, a crumpled piece of paper she held in her gloved hand. She looked at the words on the page as if trying to will them to change. "Your sister," she whispered. "I am sorry for it," Samuel said. "And he was sorry for his sister's meddling." Sorry for this woman's wasted journey. Sorry for the whole sorry mess. I will, of course, pay for your passage back. The next train east leaves in the morning." He reached into his coat for his wallet, but she put a hand up to stop him. The gesture was small but firm. "No, thank you." "Miss Marlowe," he began, his patience fraying. "There is no place for you here." "I will find a place," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a conviction that surprised him. "I am a seamstress, a good one. There must be work in the town." He almost laughed. Town was a generous word for Cedar Creek. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses. There is not enough work here to keep a mouse fed. "Miss Marlowe, not for a stranger." "Then I will travel on. To Helena, perhaps?" She looked toward the train, as if calculating the distance. "I will manage." He could see the pride warring with the exhaustion in her face, and it was then, in the unforgiving light of the late afternoon, that he truly saw her. He saw the faint, bluish shadow under her eyes, the tremor in her hands that she tried to still by clenching her valise tighter. He saw her shiver, a deep, racking shudder that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the shiver of hunger, and as she shifted her weight, she winced, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, and her hand went to her side. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The question was out before he could stop it. "I am fine," she said too quickly. A trunk fell from the rack on the train. "It is only a bruise." He looked at her, at the worn dress and the single small bag that held all she owned in the world. He thought of the cost of the ticket, the meals along the way. "What money do you have left, Miss Marlowe?" Her chin came up again, a fortress of dignity. "That is my concern. Mr. Granger." How much he insisted, his voice rougher than he intended. Her eyes flashed with defiance, but then the fight seemed to go out of her. Her shoulders slumped. She opened her small reticule and looked inside. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind. 17 cents. 17 cents. The words hung in the air between them. Not enough for a meal, let alone a ticket to Helena, not enough for anything. He stood there, his wallet in his hand, feeling like the world's biggest fool and the world's cruelest man all at once. His sister's well-meaning foolishness had brought this woman to the edge of ruin. A long, loud whistle blew from the engine. The conductor called out, "All aboard the train!" which had been panting steam like a tired animal, gave a great lurch. "The train?" she said, a note of panic in her voice. It was not the morning train. It was the evening train, the one that continued west into the deepening twilight. The last train until tomorrow. "Wait," Samuel said, turning toward the conductor. But it was too late. With a groan of metal and a chuff of smoke, the cars began to move. They slid past the platform, picking up speed, the faces of passengers blurring in the windows. It pulled away from the station, its whistle a fading cry, until it was just a dark shape shrinking against the vast, bruised twilight sky. And then it was gone. They were alone on the platform. The wind blew harder now, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Eliza Marlowe stood staring down the empty tracks, her small figure looking terribly alone against the immense landscape. She did not cry. He thought, somehow, that it would have been easier if she had. Instead, she just wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of such profound and quiet despair that it pierced the armor he had worn for 3 years. He could not leave her here. He could not take her to the boarding house in town, a rough place run by a woman who would ask questions he did not want to answer. He could not leave her to the mercy of strangers with only 17 cents to her name. He was trapped by his sister's folly, by a departing train, and by the sudden, unwelcome stirring of his own conscience. He let out a long, slow breath. "All right," he said, the word torn from him. "You can come to the ranch. My wagon is over there." She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and suspicion. "You said—" "I know what I said," he cut in, his tone harsh to cover the turmoil inside him. The train is gone. There is another in 3 days. You can stay at the ranch until then. 3 days. No more." He did not wait for her answer. He picked up her valise, which was surprisingly heavy, and strode toward the buckboard wagon hitched near the water tower. He could feel her following him, her footsteps light and hesitant on the wooden planks. The whole ride to the ranch was conducted in a stiff, heavy silence. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving streaks of orange and purple above the mountains. The air grew colder. Samuel kept his eyes on the road, a pair of ruts winding through the endless grass. He was acutely aware of the woman beside him. He could feel the warmth of her presence, a foreign and unsettling sensation. His world, for 3 years, had been a world of one. The quiet of his house was a familiar quiet. The emptiness was a known emptiness. Her presence was a disruption he did not know how to handle. He was angry with Margaret, so angry his hands ached from gripping the reins. But beneath the anger was a current of something else, something that felt dangerously like guilt. He kept seeing the look on Eliza's face when the train pulled away. Eliza, for her part, sat straight and silent, her hands folded in her lap. She looked out at the rolling land, a place so vast and empty it seemed to swallow the light. This was nothing like the tidy green hills of New England. This was a wild, untamed country, beautiful and terrifying all at once. She was terrified. Every plan she had made, every hope she had nurtured on the long journey west, had disintegrated on that train platform. She was stranded, bruised, and nearly penniless, at the mercy of a grim-faced stranger who clearly did not want her. Yet, he had not left her. When he could have walked away, he had not, and that single fact was a tiny spark of warmth in the cold dread that filled her. When they finally arrived, the ranch was a dark silhouette against the last of the light. A long, low log house stood sheltered by a small grove of cottonwoods, with a large barn and several corrals nearby. It was a solid, well-kept place, but as they drew closer, she felt a profound stillness about it, the same stillness she saw in the man beside her. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. "The house is this way." Inside, it was clean but stark. The main room held a stone fireplace, a long wooden table with 2 benches, and a few sturdy chairs. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender that seemed out of place. It was the smell of a woman's presence, long since faded. He lit a kerosene lamp, and the soft yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing a room that was more a shelter than a home. "You can have the spare room," he said, gesturing to a closed door. It is a spare room. I will get your bag." He left her standing in the middle of the room. Eliza looked around, her gaze falling on the fireplace mantel. Propped against the stone was a small, framed photograph, a woman with a gentle smile and kind eyes, her arm around a small boy with a serious expression, who looked so much like Samuel. So this was it. This was the source of the emptiness in him, the ghost that haunted this silent house. He came back with her valise and set it by the door of the room. He did not look at her. "I have chores to see to. There is cold stew in the pantry, and bread." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Mr. Granger." He paused, his back still to her. "I will not be a burden," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will work for my keep these 3 days. I can cook and clean, and I can mend anything you have that needs mending." He finally turned to face her. In the lamplight, she could see the deep lines of exhaustion and grief etched around his eyes. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. "You lost them?" she said softly. It was not a question. His face hardened, a mask of stone falling into place. "That is none of your business, Miss Marlowe." "No," she agreed quietly. "It is not, but I know the look of it. My parents died of fever 2 winters ago. My brother went to war and never came home. All I have is what is in that bag. I do not know what it is to have what you have lost, a husband or a child, but I know what it is to be the one left behind." He stared at her, and for the first time, he did not seem to be looking through her, or past her, but at her. He saw not a mail-order bride, not an inconvenience, but a woman who, like him, was fluent in the language of loss. Her pride was not arrogance. It was the last thing she had left to hold on to. His anger, he realized, was not truly directed at her, or even at his sister. It was the same old, bitter anger he held against the world, against a fate that gave and then took away without reason. He gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. He did not say anything more. He simply turned and walked out the door, into the cold Montana night, leaving her alone in the quiet, lamp-lit house. For the first time in 3 years, there was another person under his roof, and though he would not admit it, even to himself, the silence that she filled felt a little less empty. The first dawn broke cold and sharp, the light a thin gray blade across the eastern plains. Samuel rose from habit, his feet hitting the cold floorboards before his mind was fully awake. For 3 years, his mornings had been identical. He would rise in the dark, pull on his boots, and start the fire in the stove. The house would be silent, the air still and frigid. It was a loneliness so familiar it had ceased to feel like anything at all. But this morning was different. A scent, foreign and forgotten, met him as he entered the main room. Coffee. Rich and dark. The stove was already lit. A low, steady fire crackling behind the iron door, casting a warm, flickering glow on the wooden floor. Eliza Marlowe stood at the counter, her back to him, grinding more coffee beans in a small hand mill. A pot of water was already heating, and a skillet was set out, ready. She had found everything: the coffee, the mill, the matches. She wore one of her own dresses, a simple gray cotton, and had tied a spare dish towel around her waist as a makeshift apron. Her movements were quiet and efficient, the turn of the mill a soft, rhythmic whirring that was the only sound in the room. The sight of her there, in Sarah's kitchen, a place he had kept as sterile as a tomb, sent a jolt through him. It was wrong. It was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred quiet. He opened his mouth to say something, to tell her to stop, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? She was merely doing what she had promised to do. She was not being a burden. She must have heard him, because she stopped grinding and turned. Her face was composed, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Granger. The coffee will be ready in a moment. I found some bacon in the larder. I hope that is acceptable." He could only nod, feeling large and clumsy in the space. He walked to the stove to pour hot water into the wash basin, the ritual a shield against the strangeness of the morning. He was used to the silence, to the echo of his own solitary movements. Her presence was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples were spreading through every corner of the house. That first day set the tone for the next. Eliza was a constant, quiet motion. She did not ask for permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Dust that had lain undisturbed for years disappeared from the windowsills. The curtains, which he had not truly looked at since Sarah had hung them, were taken down, washed in a tub of lye soap, and rehung, their faded floral pattern looking almost cheerful in the clean light. She found his mending basket, a chaotic jumble of torn shirts and socks with holes, and set about restoring order. In the evenings, while he sat by the fire cleaning his rifle or studying his account book, the only sound would be the soft snip of her scissors and the whisper of her needle through cloth. He was a man who understood work. He could build a fence that would stand for 20 years, birth a calf in the middle of a blizzard, and read the weather in the clouds. He respected competence, and Eliza Marlowe was, without question, competent. She cooked meals that were simple but flavorful, transforming his bachelor supplies of beans and salted meat into something that tasted like real food. The house began to change. It was not just cleaner, it was warmer. It began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home, and that terrified him. Each improvement felt like a betrayal. Every time he put on a shirt and found a tear neatly stitched, he felt a pang of guilt. When he came in from the cold to the smell of baking bread, the memory of Sarah doing the same would rise up so sharply it was like a physical pain. He had promised to remember her. He had built his life around that promise, a fortress of grief to keep her memory safe. Now, this stranger from Boston was pulling out the stones one by one, letting in the light, and he did not know how to stop her without being cruel. So he retreated further into himself, his words becoming clipped and sparse, his manner gruff. He was a man of immense physical strength and skill, but when it came to the landscape of his own heart, he was hopelessly lost. Eliza felt his withdrawal. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the photograph on the mantel, his expression hardening. She understood he was guarding something precious. Her own losses were a constant companion, a quiet ache that never truly went away. She did not try to breach his walls. She simply continued her work, her quiet industry a testament to her own resilience. She was a practical woman. Grief was a part of life, but so was mending socks and baking bread. Life, in its stubborn, relentless way, went on. She had been damaged by her past, but she refused to be defined by it. She would not be weak. She would make her own way, even if it was just for 3 days in a stranger's house. On the second day, a cold rain began to fall, a steady, miserable drizzle that turned the corrals into a sea of mud. Samuel pulled on his oilskin slicker, his face set. The north fence line was down in 2 places. I need to fix it before the herd gets any ideas. I will come with you, Eliza said, appearing at his side with her own worn coat. He stopped, his hand on the door. There is no need. It is a man's work, and it is wet. I have been wet before, Mr. Granger, she said, her tone even. An extra pair of hands is always useful for stretching wire, and I will not be a burden sitting by the fire while you work in the rain. He wanted to argue, to order her to stay, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes that made him pause. He looked at her small, slender frame, and then out at the gray, weeping sky. It was a foolish idea, but arguing about it felt more exhausting than simply agreeing. With a short, irritated sigh, he nodded. Fine, but keep up. The work was cold and hard. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked through the shoulders of her coat. Her hands, accustomed to the fine work of a needle, grew numb and raw from pulling at the cold, sharp wire. But she did not complain. She held the post steady while he hammered, pulled the wire taut when he told her to, and handed him staples from the pouch at his belt. She worked with a quiet focus that, despite himself, he began to admire. They were a mile from the house when the sky, which had been a uniform gray, turned a dark, bruised purple. The drizzle intensified into a downpour, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. The wind rose, driving the rain in stinging, horizontal sheets. We need to get under cover, Samuel shouted over the wind. There is a line shack over that rise. Come on. He grabbed her hand, his rough, calloused fingers closing around her smaller, colder ones, and pulled her along. They half ran, half stumbled through the wet sagebrush, the ground slick with mud. The line shack was little more than a 1-room wooden box with a tin roof, a small stove, and a stack of firewood, left for cowboys checking on the herd. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and old smoke, but it was dry. Samuel slammed the door shut against the storm, and the world outside went quiet, replaced by the deafening roar of rain on the tin roof. He quickly lit the kindling in the small stove, and a meager warmth began to push back the damp chill. Eliza stood shivering, wringing water from the hem of her skirt, her face pale in the gloom. Here, he said, his voice rough. He pulled a dusty wool blanket from a wooden crate and shook it out. He draped it around her shoulders. His hands lingered for a second longer than necessary. Thank you, she whispered. They stood in the small, cramped space, the storm raging around them. The only light came from the orange glow of the stove. There was nowhere to look but at each other. He saw the way the firelight caught the raindrops in her dark hair, making them shine like tiny jewels. He saw the faint purple bruise on her cheek where she had told him the trunk had hit her. He saw the strength in her jaw and the exhaustion in her eyes. She looked up at him, and in that moment, the carefully constructed walls between them seemed to dissolve. They were no longer the widower and the mail-order bride, the rancher and the seamstress. They were just a man and a woman, taking shelter from a storm. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had not said. He could feel the warmth of her body through the blanket, could smell the scent of rain and soap on her skin. He did not know who moved first. He only knew that the space between them was shrinking, that his hand had come up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a drop of rain. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned into his touch, a small, unconscious sigh escaping her lips. He lowered his head, his own breath catching in his chest, his mind a sudden, roaring blank. A tremendous crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, so loud and violent it shook the very foundations of the small shack. They both flinched back as if struck. The spell shattered into 1,000 pieces. Samuel dropped his hand, and Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her eyes wide and startled. The moment was gone, lost in the echo of the thunder. An awkward, heavy silence fell between them. Samuel turned away, busying himself with adding more wood to the stove, his movements stiff. "The storm should pass soon," he said, his voice sounding unnatural to his own ears. He did not look at her again until the rain had softened to a drizzle and it was time to go. The next morning, the third day, dawned beneath a thick blanket of fog. The world outside the windows was a formless, gray void. The air was cold and still, muffling all sound. The silence in the house was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the memory of the storm, of the unspoken thing that had happened in the line shack. They ate breakfast without speaking. Eliza had packed her valise the night before. It stood by the door, a silent testament to their agreement. After they had eaten, Samuel hitched the horses to the buckboard. The ride to town was slow, the horses picking their way carefully through the thick, swirling mist. He could feel Eliza sitting beside him, a still and silent presence. He had rehearsed the words in his head all morning. He would give her the money for the ticket east, enough for her meals as well. He would thank her for her help. He would wish her a good life. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. The train was already at the station when they arrived, its great black engine hissing steam that mingled with the fog. It was a ghost train, waiting to take her away and return his life to its proper, empty order. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her valise to the platform. He turned to face her, the pouch of money heavy in his hand. This was it, the final moment. "Miss Marlowe," he began, his voice hoarse. "Eliza, thank you for everything." He held out the money. She looked at the pouch, then up at his face. Her expression was unreadable. He had to say the rest of it. He had to finish it. He opened his mouth to wish her well, to say goodbye, but the words that came out were not the ones he had practiced. He looked at the empty seat on the buckboard wagon. He thought of the drive back to the ranch, alone. He thought of the house, clean and warm and orderly, but silent again, so terribly silent. "I do not want to go back to an empty house," he said. The words torn from a place deep inside him he thought had died. It was the most honest thing he had said in 3 years. The train's whistle blew, a long, mournful sound that cut through the fog. The conductor called out, his voice impatient. Eliza looked from Samuel's face to the train, then back again. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the weighing of one unknown future against another. The train gave a great lurch, the wheels groaning as they began to turn. The moment of decision was upon her, and she did nothing. She simply stood on the platform, her hands clasped in front of her, and watched as the passenger cars slid past. She watched as the train picked up speed, its rhythmic clatter fading into the fog until it was gone completely, leaving only silence in its wake. She had missed the train. They stood on the empty platform, wrapped in the damp, gray quiet. The 3 days were over. The promise was fulfilled, but she was still there. He looked at her, and she met his gaze. And in that shared, silent moment, a new, unspoken agreement was forged. What it was, neither of them knew, but as he picked up her valise to carry it back to the wagon, he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and profound, that he was no longer going back to an empty house. The decision, made in the silent fog of the train station, settled over the Granger Ranch like a quiet snowfall, changing the landscape of their lives in ways neither Samuel nor Eliza yet understood. There was no discussion of terms, no new promises made. Eliza simply unpacked her valise again, and the rhythm of their days, established over the previous 3, resumed. But now, underneath the surface of chores and shared meals, a new tension hummed. The question of her presence, once defined by a train schedule, was now an open-ended fact, a source of comfort to Samuel and a wellspring of gossip for the town of Cedar Creek. Word traveled fast in a place that small. Samuel Granger, the widower who had not looked at another woman in 3 years, had a mail-order bride living in his house. The talk started as whispers in the general store, quiet speculation over cracker barrels and bolts of fabric. It grew louder in the saloon. Fueled by whiskey and boredom, some were sympathetic, others suspicious. Most were simply curious about the woman from Boston who had appeared as suddenly as a Chinook wind. Samuel felt the weight of their stares whenever he rode into town for supplies. He ignored them, his face a mask of indifference. But the whispers followed him like his own shadow. He was a private man, and this intrusion into his life, his grief, felt like a trespass. Yet, he could not send Eliza away. The thought of the house returning to its hollow silence was now unbearable. He introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, Jake Morrison and Tom Bradley. Jake, his foreman, was a man in his late 40s, weathered and quiet, with eyes that missed nothing. He had been with Samuel for 10 years, a bedrock of loyalty and common sense. He nodded to Eliza, a flicker of surprise in his steady gaze, but his handshake was firm and respectful. Tom was younger, barely 20, a lanky boy with a quick smile and an even quicker hand with a Colt. He looked at Eliza with unconcealed curiosity and a touch of youthful awe, immediately removing his hat and stammering a greeting. Eliza, for her part, met the community's curiosity with a calm, unbreachable dignity. She nodded politely to those who stared, her expression serene. She understood their speculation. In their eyes, she was an adventuress, a woman of questionable morals who had come west to trap a lonely man. They did not see the desperation that had driven her from Boston, the quiet terror of having nowhere left to go. She did not need them to. Her own self-respect was a shield she had learned to carry long ago. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, determined to earn her keep. She asked Samuel to explain the ranch's books to a ledger he kept in a disorganized pile of receipts and scrawled notes. With meticulous care, she created a new ledger, her neat, precise script bringing order to the chaos. For the first time, Samuel could see at a glance his profits, his losses, and the exact count of his herd. He watched her, bent over the table in the evening lamplight, and felt a grudging admiration. She had a mind for numbers and a grasp of logic that was as sharp as her sewing needle. This new order became critical sooner than either of them expected. The greatest power in the Cedar Creek Valley belonged to Bill Hartley. Hartley owned the sprawling Circle H Ranch, a vast empire of land and cattle that dwarfed every other holding. He was a big man with a florid face and a voice accustomed to being obeyed. He saw the law not as a set of rules for all men, but as a tool to be used for his own benefit. His son, Tommy, was a spoiled, arrogant young man who rode in his father's shadow and had been suspected, though never proven, of helping his father's herd grow by rebranding stray cattle from smaller ranches. One crisp morning, Tom Bradley rode in from the west pasture. his young face pale with alarm. "Samuel, it is the herd. 20 head, at least, gone. The fence is cut clean through." A cold knot formed in Samuel's stomach. He, Jake, and Tom rode out immediately. The evidence was clear. A section of barbed wire fence had been expertly cut, and the tracks of at least 20 cattle, pushed hard by 2 horses, led directly south, toward Circle H land. "It is Hartley," Jake said, his voice grim as he studied the hoofprints. "Or his boy." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Samuel. This was not the first time Hartley had encroached on his land, but it was the most brazen theft yet. "Tom, you ride to town. Get Sheriff Collins. Tell him what happened. Jake and I are going after them." "That is a bad idea." "Samuel," Jake cautioned, "Hartley will have a dozen men with him." "They are my cattle," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am not letting him get away with it." They followed the tracks for 2 hours, the trail leading them deep into a rocky canyon that marked the unofficial border of Hartley's ranch. As they rounded a narrow bend, they saw them. The stolen cattle were being held in a small, boxed-in meadow by 2 Circle H riders. Tommy Hartley was not among them. Samuel pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. "Those are Granger cattle," he yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Turn them back." The 2 riders exchanged a look, then grinned. One of them, a man with a mean, pinched face, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "These are Circle H cattle now. Granger, you are trespassing. Ride out before you get hurt." "The hell I will," Samuel said, leveling his rifle. What happened next was a blur of chaotic motion and noise. The riders went for their guns. Samuel fired a warning shot over their heads, the sound cracking through the canyon. Jake fired as well. One of the riders yelped and spurred his horse back, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. The other returned fire, his shot wild, but a third shot came from the rocks above them, a place they had not seen. Samuel felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through his left arm, just above the elbow. The force of it nearly knocked him from the saddle. His rifle clattered to the ground. Jake yelled his name and fired into the rocks, providing cover as he spurred his horse forward, grabbing the reins of Samuel's spooked mount. "We have to go now." Bleeding and dizzy with pain, Samuel knew Jake was right. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They wheeled their horses around and galloped back the way they had come, the sound of mocking laughter following them out of the canyon. By the time they reached the ranch, Samuel was pale and swaying in the saddle. Eliza met them at the door, her face draining of all color when she saw the blood soaking his sleeve and dripping from his fingertips. "Get him inside," she said to Jake, her voice calm and commanding, betraying none of the fear that clenched her heart. "Put him on the table. Start a fire in the stove and put a big pot of water on to boil. Now." She moved with a surgeon's focus. She cut away the bloody sleeve with her sewing shears, her touch gentle but firm. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm, a deep, ragged gouge that was bleeding freely. It was a flesh wound. Thankfully, the bullet had passed clean through, while Jake held a clean cloth pressed tight against the wound. Eliza tore strips from a linen sheet and gathered her sewing kit, a bottle of whiskey, and carbolic acid from the medicine chest. For the next hour, she worked to clean and stitch the wound. Samuel, his teeth clenched against the pain, never made a sound. He watched her, his vision blurring in and out. He saw the fierce concentration on her face, the steady competence of her hands as she threaded the needle. He had seen men die from wounds less clean than this. He had seen his own wife fade away from a fever a doctor could not stop. He had felt utterly helpless. But this woman, this stranger, was not helpless. She was fighting. For him. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Collins and a very worried Tom Bradley arrived. Collins was a good man, but a cautious one, perpetually caught between his duty and the political reality of Bill Hartley's influence. He listened to the story, his face grim. "I will ride out to the Circle H, Samuel. I will ask him about it." But you know how this will go. He will deny everything. And it is your word against his men's." "It is not just his word," a quiet voice said from the doorway. Eliza stood there, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She held the new ledger in her hands. "Sheriff, I have a complete and detailed record of every head of cattle Mr. Granger owns, including their brands and markings. We can identify every single one of the stolen animals. If Mr. Hartley has them, he will have to explain how they came to be in his possession. It is no longer just a vague accusation. It is a specific list of stolen property. That makes it a federal concern. Does it not interfering with commerce across territory lines?" The sheriff stared at her, then at the ledger, a flicker of new respect in his eyes. What had been a simple ranch dispute had just been elevated. Paperwork and federal laws were things men like Hartley could not so easily dismiss with threats. As the sheriff rode off, a new rider appeared. This one, coming from the direction of the Circle H. It was Bill Hartley himself, flanked by his son Tommy and 2 of his men. He dismounted and strode up to the porch of the Granger house as if he owned it, his face a thundercloud. Samuel, his arm tightly bandaged and held in a sling Eliza had fashioned, rose from his chair and went to meet him, Jake at his side. "Granger," Hartley boomed, "your man Collins was just at my ranch, filling my ears with nonsense about stolen cattle and federal laws. I do not know what kind of game you are playing, but I suggest you stop it. You will find I am not a man to be trifled with." "There is no game, Hartley," Samuel said, his voice cold. "Your men stole 20 of my steers. I want them back." Hartley laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You have no proof of that, just the word of a boy." "We have the tracks leading to your land," Samuel countered, "and a bullet from one of your men in my arm." "My men were defending our property from a trespasser," Hartley sneered. "That is what they will tell the sheriff. Who do you think he will believe?" It was then that Eliza stepped out onto the porch, placing herself just to the side of Samuel. She did not look frightened. She looked like a schoolteacher about to reprimand a troublesome student. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still afternoon air, "we are not interested in a feud. We are interested in the rule of law. The sheriff has a copy of our ledger, which lists, by brand and description, every animal that was taken this morning. We expect those animals to be returned. If they are not, we will be forced to contact the United States Marshals Service and the territorial governor. Cattle rustling is a serious crime." Hartley's face, already red, deepened to a shade of purple. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. He looked from her to Samuel, his eyes narrowed with contempt. "So this is your new woman, the mail-order bride. Got yourself a bookkeeper from Boston. Have you Granger one who thinks she can come out here and tell us how to live?" The insult was meant to sting, to diminish her in Samuel's eyes and in the eyes of his men. Samuel's good hand clenched into a fist. He took a step forward, but Eliza put a hand on his uninjured arm, a small, restraining gesture. She met Hartley's glare without flinching. "I am a citizen of this territory, Mr. Hartley. Same as you, and I believe the law applies to all citizens equally. Return the cattle. It is as simple as that." For a long moment, Hartley just stared at her, his jaw working. He was a bully, used to bluster and intimidation. He did not know how to fight this quiet, unyielding logic. Finally, with a curse, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his horse. "This is not over. Granger," he snarled, swinging himself into the saddle. "You will regret this." He and his men galloped away in a cloud of dust. That night, as Eliza was changing the dressing on his arm, Samuel finally spoke. "You should not have done that. You made him angry." "He was already angry," she replied, her fingers moving deftly as she tied the new bandage. "Men like that are always angry. It is how they get their way. But they do not like complications. They do not like paperwork. And they do not like the threat of authority higher than their own." She met his eyes. "You were bleeding on your own porch. Samuel, I could not stand by and do nothing." He did not know what to say. He was a man who solved his problems with his fists or his gun. She had faced down Bill Hartley with a book of numbers and the threat of a letter. He was not sure which was braver. Hartley was true to his word. The cattle were not returned. Instead, a campaign of petty harassment began. A section of fence would be cut in the night, letting a dozen steers wander off. A small stack of hay near an outlying pasture was found smoldering one morning, clearly the result of arson. The whispers in town grew louder, now tinged with malice. Samuel Granger's mail-order bride was a troublemaker, a woman who did not know her place, bringing a feud down on all their heads. Eliza felt the cold shoulders in the general store, heard the sudden silence when she entered a room, but she held her head high, her composure a silent rebuke to their judgment. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a fighter, and in the quiet of the ranch house, in the shared glances over the supper table, Samuel began to realize that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for him. The unspoken truce that existed between Samuel and Eliza was as fragile as a winter leaf. They moved around each other with a careful choreography, a man and a woman sharing a roof but not a life. The house was no longer silent, but it was not yet filled with ease. It was filled with the ghosts of what might have been and the fear of what could be. For Samuel, every shared laugh, every comfortable silence with Eliza felt like a small act of treason against Sarah's memory. He would find himself watching Eliza as she worked, admiring the line of her throat or the way a stray curl escaped her bun, and a cold wave of guilt would wash over him. He was a man defined by his loyalty, and he felt as though he were living a lie, betraying the woman he had sworn to love forever by simply allowing himself to feel again. He had built a fortress around his heart, and the woman inside its walls was a memory. To let another in felt like tearing that fortress down, stone by sacred stone. Eliza waged her own silent war. She fought against the shadow of the woman in the photograph on the mantel. She saw the perfection of Sarah's smile, the easy contentment in her eyes as she held her child, and Eliza felt hopelessly inadequate. She was a survivor, a pragmatist, a woman who had come west not for love but for a foothold in the world. How could her quiet competence ever compare to the cherished memory of a beloved wife and mother? She saw the way Samuel's gaze would turn distant, the way a sudden sadness would cross his face for no apparent reason, and she knew he was with his ghost. She feared she would always be an outsider in this house, a guest in another woman's life, a placeholder who was not quite enough to make him forget. The tension on the ranch was amplified by Bill Hartley's escalating campaign of harassment. The cut fences and spoiled hay were replaced by something more sinister. Hartley, unable to intimidate Samuel or outwit Eliza, had hired a handful of rough men, gunslingers with cold eyes and a thirst for trouble. They did not attack the Granger Ranch directly. Instead, they took up residence in Cedar Creek's saloon, their presence a constant, brooding threat. They drank Hartley's whiskey and spoke loudly of the trouble Granger's Eastern woman was causing. Their job was to poison the town against Samuel, to isolate him until he was forced to either fight a battle he could not win or sell his land for a fraction of its worth. One afternoon, Jake Morrison rode back from town, his face tight with anger. "It is the new men Hartley hired," he told Samuel. "They are in the saloon, running their mouths. They are telling everyone that you are too cowardly to face Hartley, and that your woman is the one running the ranch now. They are making it ugly. Samuel." Samuel's hands clenched. This was Hartley's game. He wanted to provoke a fight, to draw Samuel into a public confrontation where the odds would be stacked against him. He could not afford to take the bait. But the insult against Eliza, the crude suggestion that she was anything less than honorable, lit a dangerous fire in his gut. That evening, the air in the house was thick with unspoken anxiety. Samuel was quiet, his anger a palpable force in the room. He knew he had to do something, but a direct confrontation was suicide. After their silent supper, he went to the barn, needing the familiar work of mending a harness to soothe the turmoil in his mind. He was so lost in thought that he did not hear her approach. "You cannot go into that saloon," Eliza said, her voice soft but firm from the barn doorway. He did not turn around. "It is my fight." "It is our fight," she corrected him, "and it will not be won with a gun. That is what he wants. He wants you to lose your temper. He wants you to be seen as the aggressor. That is not the way." "Then what is the way?" he asked, his voice rough with frustration. "Do I let them slander your name all over town? Do I let them run me off my own land?" "No," she said. She stepped into the barn, holding a small bundle of papers tied with a string. It was the ledger, and several letters. "You fight him with the one thing he does not have, the law." The next day, Samuel rode out to check on a windmill pump at the far edge of his property, a full day's ride. He left with a sense of unease, telling Eliza to keep to the house and to send Tom for him if there was any trouble. The moment he was gone, Eliza put on her best dress, the dark wool she had traveled in, and pinned on her hat. She walked to the stable, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Tom," she said to the young cowboy, her voice betraying none of her fear, "I need you to drive me into town. I have an errand at the general store." Tom looked at her, his expression worried. "Samuel said for you to stay put. Ma'am, with them fellas in the saloon, it ain't safe." "I will be perfectly safe." "Tom," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "I am not going to the saloon. I am going to the store. Please hitch up the wagon." Once in town, Eliza went directly to the store, purchasing a few small items to maintain the pretense of her errand. Then, leaving Tom with the wagon, she took a deep breath and walked across the dusty street. She did not turn toward the sheriff's office. She walked directly to the swinging doors of the Cedar Creek Saloon. The saloon went silent the moment she stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, whiskey, and unwashed men. Every eye turned to her. At a back table sat the 5 men Hartley had hired. They were lounging in their chairs, their gun belts slung low on their hips. They looked at her with a mixture of surprise and contemptuous amusement. Eliza ignored the stares. She walked directly to their table, her steps measured, her back straight. She stopped before the man who appeared to be their leader, a hard-faced man with a scar running through one eyebrow. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet, "my name is Eliza Marlowe. I work for Mr. Samuel Granger. I understand you are in the employ of Mr. Bill Hartley." The leader smirked, leaning back in his chair. "What if we are, little lady you lost?" "On the contrary," Eliza said, "I have a message for you from Mr. Granger." She placed her bundle of papers on the table. She did not untie it. "This is a copy of a letter we sent 2 days ago to the United States Marshal in Helena. It details the theft of our cattle, the unprovoked assault on Mr. Granger, and the ongoing campaign of intimidation you are currently engaged in on behalf of Mr. Hartley." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It also contains sworn affidavits from 2 of Mr. Hartley's former employees, detailing his long history of illegal rebranding and land fraud. It seems Mr. Hartley is not always prompt in paying his men, and disgruntled employees tend to have long memories." The men's smirks faded. They exchanged uneasy glances. This was not how things were supposed to go. "This letter," Eliza continued, her voice cool and steady, "also makes it clear that should any further harm come to Mr. Granger, his property, or myself, the marshals are to consider it a federal crime and an attempt to intimidate a federal witness. Conspiracy charges carry a lengthy prison sentence." She looked each man in the eye. "Mr. Hartley is paying you to be bullies. I doubt he is paying you enough to spend 20 years in a federal prison. Your business here is concluded. I suggest you collect your pay from Mr. Hartley and be on the next train out of town. It leaves at 5 o'clock. She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the saloon, her head held high, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. By the time Samuel returned to the ranch at dusk, exhausted and on edge, the news was already waiting for him. Tom, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and admiration, told him the whole story. Samuel listened, his expression unreadable. When Tom had finished, Samuel walked into the house. Eliza was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew as if it were just another ordinary day. He walked up behind her, and she turned, a question in her eyes. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. He could feel the frantic beating of his own heart, a mix of terror at what could have happened to her and an overwhelming, fierce wave of something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel for a very long time. It was into this fragile, charged moment that the world intruded. A wagon, driven hard, rattled into the yard. A woman's voice called out, sharp and familiar. "Samuel, Samuel Granger, are you in there?" Samuel stiffened. It was his sister, Margaret. He stepped back from Eliza as Margaret burst through the door. She was a stout, determined woman with Samuel's jaw and an unstoppable will. Her eyes took in the scene at a glance. Samuel and Eliza standing too close, the sudden intimacy that hung in the air between them. "So it is true," Margaret said, her hands on her hips. "The whole town is talking. You have this woman living here, in your house, in Sarah's house. Samuel, what were you thinking?" "Margaret, this is not the time," Samuel said, his voice low and angry. "It is exactly the time," she retorted. "Her reputation is in tatters, and so is yours. A decent, unmarried woman cannot simply live with a man. It is not right. People are saying the worst things." "I do not care what people are saying," Samuel bit out. "Well, you should." Margaret turned her sharp gaze on Eliza. "And you, Miss, I may have written that letter, and I may have been wrong to do so without his permission. But I brought you here to be a wife, not a housekeeper living in sin." Eliza paled, but her chin came up. "My arrangement with Mr. Granger is a matter of business. It is perfectly honorable." "Honorable," Margaret scoffed. "There is nothing honorable about this. There is only one way to make this right. You have to marry her, Samuel, immediately." "No," Samuel said, the word like a stone. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. "I cannot." "Cannot or will not?" Margaret's voice softened slightly. "Samuel, Sarah is gone. She has been gone for 3 years. You cannot bring her back by turning your house into a tomb, and you cannot honor her memory by closing off your heart forever. Being loyal to the dead does not mean you have to abandon the living." Her words struck a chord deep inside him. He looked at Eliza, who stood pale and silent, her pride wounded, her future once again thrown into uncertainty by the whims of others. He saw the woman who had faced down Bill Hartley, who had walked into a saloon full of armed men, who had stitched his arm and brought order to his life. She was not trying to replace Sarah. She was her own person, strong and brave and real. She was alive, and in that moment, he realized his sister was right. His loyalty to Sarah's memory did not have to be a cage. It could be a foundation. The love he had for her did not shrink because he felt something for Eliza. It was not a finite thing. "Margaret," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "leave us." After a moment's hesitation, his sister nodded and left the house, closing the door softly behind her. Samuel turned to Eliza. The air was thick with all the things they had never said, all the boundaries they had never crossed. "She is right," he said, "about the talk, about everything." He took a step toward her. "This is not fair to you. I brought you into this, and I have put you in an impossible position." He took a deep breath. "Eliza Marlowe, I am asking you to be my wife, not because of my sister or the town, or to save your reputation, but because I do not want to go back to an empty house, because when I was bleeding, you were the one who held me together, and because I am a better man when you are here." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She looked at him, at this quiet, wounded man who was offering her not a grand passion, but something far more precious, a partnership, a safe harbor, a home. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel, I will." The wedding was a simple affair, held 3 days later in the small Cedar Creek church. Jake Morrison stood as Samuel's witness, and the sheriff's wife stood with Eliza. The town watched, their whispers now a mixture of surprise and grudging approval. In the harsh reality of the frontier, this was a practical solution, a way of restoring order. That night, back at the ranch, Samuel built a fire in the hearth. He and Eliza stood on opposite sides of the room, a new and profound shyness between them. They were husband and wife, but they were still strangers in so many ways. He walked to her, taking her hands in his. They were cold. He led her to the fire, its warm light dancing on their faces. "Eliza," he said softly. He reached up and gently removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall in a dark cascade over her shoulders. He leaned down and pressed a soft, hesitant kiss to her lips. It was a kiss of promise, not of passion. It was a beginning, gentle and uncertain. He drew her closer, a quiet murmur of her name against her hair. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the eaves, but inside the small log house, for the first time in a long time, there was the sound of a new and fragile peace. Their marriage began not with a honeymoon, but with the relentless preparations for winter. The brief golden autumn of Montana gave way to a hard, gray sky that promised snow. Samuel and his men worked from sunup to sundown, reinforcing the barn, stocking hay, and moving the bulk of the herd to the sheltered pastures in the low valleys. Their new life together was forged in the rhythm of shared labor. Eliza worked alongside them, her hands growing calloused, her face chapped by the wind. She learned to mend harnesses, to mix feed for the calves, and to read the signs of an approaching storm. Their quiet, separate spaces in the house began to merge. Her sewing basket found a permanent home by the fire, next to his stack of ledgers. His coat, thrown over a chair, no longer felt like an intrusion to her, but a familiar presence. The polite distance between them slowly eroded, worn away by the daily necessity of partnership. The first snow fell in late November, a gentle dusting that covered the golden plains in a blanket of white, but it was only a prelude. 2 weeks before Christmas, the real storm hit. It came from the north, a solid wall of gray that swallowed the mountains and then the plains. The wind began as a low moan and rose to a shrieking, relentless howl that rattled the window panes and drove fine, stinging snow through every tiny crack in the log walls of the house. For 3 days, the world shrank to the confines of the ranch house and the barn. The snow fell so thick and fast that the 20 yards between the two buildings became a perilous journey through a blinding white chaos. They had to string a rope between the house and the barn door just to find their way. Drifts piled up against the walls, burying the windows on the north side and sealing the front door shut, forcing them to use the back entrance. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent presence that clawed at the roof and screamed down the chimney. Inside, a strange and intimate world was created. The constant shared danger stripped away the last of their polite formalities. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by necessity, every 4 hours, day and night. Samuel and Jake would battle their way to the barn to feed and water the cattle they had managed to shelter there. The animals were restless, their lowing a constant, anxious chorus beneath the scream of the wind. Eliza kept the fire in the house roaring, melting snow for water and keeping a huge pot of coffee perpetually hot. She cooked endless pots of stew for the men when they stumbled back inside, their beards and coats caked with ice, their faces raw from the wind. She checked on Tom, who had come down with a fever and was shivering under a pile of blankets in the spare room. She was the calm, steady center of their small, besieged world. On the second night of the storm, Samuel came back from the barn, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Jake had taken the next watch. The wind had momentarily lessened, and in the relative quiet, another sound became audible, a high, mournful howling, closer than it should be. Wolves, driven down from the high country by the storm and the scarcity of game. They were circling, drawn by the scent of the penned cattle. "They will not get into the barn," Samuel said, more to reassure himself than her. "The walls are solid." "But they will spook the cattle," Eliza said, her face pale in the lamplight. A panicked steer could break a leg, or trample a calf. She looked at the Winchester rifle resting on its pegs above the fireplace. "You have to teach me how to use that." He stared at her. "No, it is not for you." He thought of Sarah, who had hated the sound of gunfire, who had been terrified of the harsh realities of this land. "This is not Boston." "Samuel," Eliza said, her voice firm, "I am not a guest in this house anymore. I am your wife. This is my home, and my livestock in that barn as much as it is yours. I will not be helpless. I need to know how to protect it. Teach me." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the same resolve that had faced down Bill Hartley. He knew she was right. Being a husband meant protecting her, but it also meant respecting her strength. He took the rifle down from the wall. In the warm, fire-lit room, with the blizzard raging outside, he showed her how it worked. He explained the heft and balance of it, the mechanism of the lever action, the satisfying click as a shell was chambered. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. She was a quick study, her mind grasping the mechanics with the same precision she applied to her ledgers. The next afternoon, during a lull in the storm, he took her out behind the barn. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the air so cold it burned the lungs. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. The first time she fired, the recoil slammed the rifle butt hard against her shoulder, and the shot went wide. But she set her jaw, planted her feet as he had shown her, and tried again. The second shot was closer. The third sent the can spinning off the post into a snowdrift. A small, fierce smile of satisfaction touched her lips. That night, the wolves grew bolder. Their howls were no longer distant, but just outside the walls of the barn, a pack of hungry shadows in the swirling snow. Jake was with Tom, who was delirious with fever. Samuel was exhausted, having been awake for most of the past 48 hours. "I need to get out to the barn," he said, pulling on his frozen coat. "You are exhausted," Eliza said. "Let me go. I will not go alone. I will fire from the hayloft door. They will not even see me." He wanted to say no, but he could barely stand. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and nodded. He handed her the rifle and a box of shells. "One shot," he said, "into the air, just to scare them. Do not try to be a hero." She pulled on his spare oilskin slicker over her own coat, wrapped a scarf around her head, and stepped out into the howling chaos, the rifle clutched in her hands. Samuel stood at the window, his heart in his throat, watching her small figure fight its way along the guide rope, disappearing into the white fury. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He heard the low, panicked bellows of the cattle, and then, sharp and clear even over the wind, the single crack of the Winchester. A few moments later, she was back, her face flushed with the cold and a strange, exhilarating light in her eyes. "They are gone," she said, her breath coming in white puffs. "They scattered the moment I fired." She leaned the rifle against the wall and began to peel off her wet outer layers. She had done it. She had faced the storm and the wolves, and she had not flinched. The blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under 4 feet of silent, pristine snow. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. But the beauty of the scene was deceptive. The real work, the assessment of the damage, was just beginning. Hundreds of their cattle, the ones left in the sheltered valleys, had drifted with the storm, seeking shelter from the wind. Now, they were scattered for miles, lost in snow-filled coulees and deep drifts, vulnerable to the starving wolf packs. To lose those cattle would mean financial ruin. As Samuel, Jake, and a recovered Tom were saddling their horses for the grim task of searching for the survivors, a rider appeared, picking his way slowly through the deep snow. It was one of Bill Hartley's men. He carried a white cloth tied to a stick. "Mr. Granger," the man said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mr. Hartley sends his compliments. He says the storm was hard on all of us. He lost cattle as well. He says the wolves are running in a big pack, bigger than he has seen in years. He says it is foolish for one man to hunt them alone. He proposes a truce. His men and your men. We hunt the wolves together. We find what cattle we can, and we sort them out by brand later. He says for today, there is no Circle H and no Granger Ranch. There is just ranchers trying to survive." Samuel was stunned into silence. He looked at Jake, who simply raised an eyebrow. This was unheard of. Bill Hartley did not cooperate. He conquered. But the blizzard had been a great equalizer. It was a foe that could not be bullied or bought. It had reminded every man in the valley, no matter how powerful, of his own vulnerability. Survival, Samuel realized, was not just about strength. It was about knowing when to accept help. "Tell Hartley we will ride with him," Samuel said. For the next week, an unlikely alliance rode the plains. Samuel Granger and Bill Hartley, enemies for years, worked side by side. They tracked the wolves, their shared expertise a formidable weapon. They dug half-frozen cattle out of deep snowdrifts, their men working together to save the animals, regardless of the brand on their hides. In the evenings, they shared coffee and food around a blazing fire, the talk not of property lines or old grievances, but of the shared enemy of winter. Samuel saw a different side of Hartley. The blustering arrogance was gone, replaced by a grudging respect and a deep, practical knowledge of the land. Hartley, in turn, saw Samuel's quiet competence and the fierce loyalty of his men. He also saw Eliza, who ran the base camp with quiet efficiency, organizing supplies, tending to minor injuries, and ensuring every man was fed and had a dry place to sleep. He watched the way Samuel and Eliza worked together, the unspoken communication, the easy partnership. On the last day of the hunt, after the wolf pack had been scattered and the last of the surviving cattle rounded up, Hartley rode alongside Samuel. "That wife of yours," Hartley said, breaking a long silence. "She is a formidable woman." "Yes," Samuel said simply. "She is." "I was wrong about you, Granger," Hartley admitted, the words clearly costing him some effort. "And about her, this land, it has a way of testing a person, showing you what they are really made of." He extended a gloved hand. "The cattle my boy found a few months back, they will be back in your pasture by tomorrow morning. We will call it even." Samuel looked at the outstretched hand, then at the man's face. He saw not an enemy, but another rancher, another man trying to carve out a life in this beautiful, unforgiving country. He shook the hand. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. It was the first step toward a different kind of justice, one built not on fences and feuds, but on the shared understanding that sometimes the only way to survive the storm is to ride into it together. The truce with Bill Hartley held as solid and unyielding as the frozen ground of winter. When the great thaw finally came, melting the mountains of snow into rushing, muddy torrents, it was as if the bitterness between the valley's ranchers had thawed as well. The 20 stolen cattle were returned to the Granger pasture, as promised. There was no apology, but there was a nod of acknowledgement from Hartley when he and Samuel passed on the road to town, a silent understanding that they were bound by the shared memory of the blizzard. They were no longer enemies, but neighbors, wary but respectful. Spring arrived in a rush of brilliant green, chasing the last of the snow from the high meadows. The world felt new, washed clean and full of promise. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet companionship. The careful distance Samuel and Eliza had once maintained was gone, replaced by an easy intimacy forged in the heart of the storm. They were a team, their lives woven together by the threads of daily work and shared responsibility. He found himself seeking her opinion on which bull to buy, and she consulted him on the best place to plant a vegetable garden. The house was filled with the low murmur of their conversations, and the silence, when it fell, was no longer empty, but comfortable and content. Yet a shadow of the past remained. Samuel had opened his house to her, and then his life. But his heart was still a guarded place. He had not spoken of Sarah or Daniel since the day Eliza had arrived. The photograph still sat on the mantel, a silent sentinel from a life that was over. He knew he loved Eliza. The realization had come to him not in a rush, but slowly, like the turning of a season. It was in the way his eyes sought her out across a crowded room, the way the sound of her laughter could ease the weariness from his bones, the way the thought of her facing the wolves in the storm still made his blood run cold. But the words remained locked inside him, held captive by a grief he did not know how to release. One evening in late spring, they sat before the fire. A gentle rain was falling outside, a soft, soothing drumming on the roof. Eliza was mending one of his shirts, her head bent to her work, the firelight catching the rich, dark sheen of her hair. Samuel was watching her, not the work of her hands, but the small, thoughtful frown of concentration on her face. He was filled with a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. And with that peace came a sudden, sharp terror. "I was afraid," he said, the words coming out rough and quiet, surprising even himself. Eliza looked up, her needle poised in midair. "During the storm, we all were—" "No," he said, shaking his head. He looked at her, truly looked at her, letting her see past the walls he had so carefully built. "Not of the storm, not of the wolves. I was afraid for you. When you went out into the blizzard with that rifle, every second you were gone, it was the worst feeling I have had in 3 years." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "My greatest fear used to be that I would forget Sarah, that I would betray her memory. But I was wrong. My greatest fear now is losing you." The admission hung in the warm, firelit air between them. It was everything he had been unable to say. A confession of love and terror all at once. Eliza put her sewing aside and moved to sit on the hearth rug at his feet. She took his large, calloused hand in both of her own. Tears shone in her eyes. "You will not lose me. Samuel," she whispered, "I am not going anywhere." He looked down at their joined hands, at her smaller, finer ones resting in his. He had lived so long with ghosts. He had almost forgotten the solid, warm reality of the living. Eliza hesitated for a moment, and he saw a flicker of her own uncertainty in her eyes. "There is something else," she said, her voice barely audible. "Something I have to tell you." She took a breath. I believe I might be with child." The world stopped. The sound of the rain, the crackle of the fire. Everything faded into a dull roar in his ears. A child. His child. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy surged through him, so powerful it took his breath away. A new beginning. A new life. A son or a daughter to fill the silent corners of this house with laughter. But then, as quickly as the joy had come, a cold, black wave of dread rose up to swallow it. He saw a different room, a different fire. He saw Sarah, her face pale with fever, her life slipping away. He saw his son, Daniel, small and still in his cradle. The loss, the terrible, helpless agony of it, came rushing back, as sharp and raw as if it had happened yesterday. He could not go through that again. He could not survive it. He must have pulled his hand away. The color drained from Eliza's face, and a look of profound hurt filled her eyes. Samuel. He could not speak. He was drowning in the past, the old grief of physical weight pressing down on his chest. He saw the fear in her face, the fear that she was not enough, that the ghost of his dead wife was stronger than the reality of his living one. And in that moment, he knew he had a choice. He could retreat into the familiar fortress of his grief, and in doing so, lose everything he had just admitted he was terrified of losing. Or he could choose the future. He could choose her. With a strength he did not know he possessed, he pushed the ghosts away. He reached for her, pulling her up from the floor and into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his. No, he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Do not look like that. I am not afraid. I am happy. The word felt foreign on his tongue, but it was true. Underneath the terror was a deep, powerful current of joy. I am happy, he said again, more firmly this time, and I am terrified. But I will not lose you. I will not lose this child. I will not. She looked up at him, and the hurt in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, brilliant hope. The firelight danced on the tears that tracked down her cheeks. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. She leaned in to find his lips with her own, a kiss that was both a question and an answer. She whispered for him not to stop, a soft plea against his mouth. He deepened the kiss, his arms tightening around her, his breath quickening to match hers. Outside, the rain fell and the wind rustled through the tall pines, but inside the warm, fire-lit room, they were the only two people in the world, building a new life on the foundation of the old. The arrival of the new threat came with the spring mud. In a polished carriage that looked ridiculously out of place in the dusty street of Cedar Creek, two men in dark suits and city hats stepped out, their faces pale and unaccustomed to the sun. They represented a railroad consortium from Philadelphia, and they had come to the valley with an offer. They wanted to buy land, large tracts of it, for a price that was insultingly low. They did not want to be neighbors. They wanted to be owners. They started with the smaller ranches, the ones most vulnerable after the hard winter. They made their offers, and when the ranchers refused, the threats began. Not threats of violence, like Hartley's, but of a different kind. Vague warnings about disputed land titles, hints about the railroad's influence with the territorial government, suggestions that a rancher who did not cooperate might find it impossible to get his cattle to market. They came to Samuel's ranch one afternoon. He met them on the porch, Eliza standing just inside the doorway, listening, the lead man, a Mr. Davies with cold, calculating eyes, made his offer. Samuel refused, politely but firmly. Davies's smile did not reach his eyes. That is a regrettable decision. Mr. Granger, progress is coming to this valley. Those who stand in its way are likely to be swept aside. It would be a shame to see a man like you, with a new wife and perhaps a family on the way, lose everything over a matter of sentiment. The veiled threat was unmistakable. After they had gone, Samuel stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the horizon. This was a fight he did not know how to win. He could not face down a railroad with a rifle. That evening, he was quiet, the weight of this new threat pressing down on him. It was Eliza who spoke, her voice cutting through his worried thoughts. She had her ledger open on the table, but she was not looking at numbers. She was writing. We cannot fight them alone. Samuel, she said, no single rancher can. They will pick us off one by one. I know, he said, his voice heavy. When Bill Hartley was our enemy, we fought him. When the blizzard was our enemy, we worked with him. This is no different. The enemy is not a man, but an idea. The idea that one powerful entity can devour all the smaller ones. We must fight it with a better idea. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a fierce intelligence. We must form a stockmen's association. All of us. Hartley, the Petersons, every rancher in this valley. We pool our resources. We hire a lawyer from Helena to represent us all. We create a legal fund. We agree, in writing, that none of us will sell to the railroad without the consent of the majority. We create our own market, our own rules. We face them not as a dozen small, vulnerable ranches, but as one single, powerful entity. We fight their contracts with our own. He stared at her, at the simple, brilliant logic of her plan. She was using the tools of their enemy, the law and the power of association, against them. She was building a different kind of fence, a legal one, to protect them all. He felt a surge of pride so immense it almost overwhelmed him. This was his wife, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that with her by his side, They could face any storm that was to come. The Cedar Creek Stockmen's Association was born not in a grand meeting hall, but around the long wooden table in Samuel Granger's house. Eliza's idea, once spoken aloud, took on a life of its own. Samuel, swallowing his pride, was the first to ride to the Circle H. He laid out Eliza's proposal to Bill Hartley, not as a challenge, but as a necessity. Hartley, who had spent his life competing with his neighbors, listened in silence. The threat from the railroad men was a greater danger than any petty squabble over grazing rights. He saw the logic in Eliza's plan, the cold, hard sense of it. He agreed. With Hartley on board, the other ranchers quickly followed. They met, a dozen tough, independent men, unused to cooperation. They argued and debated, but under Eliza's quiet, organized guidance, they hammered out the details. They elected Samuel as their president, a testament to the new respect he had earned. They hired a lawyer from Helena who, armed with their collective power, sent a firm, legally binding letter to the Philadelphia Consortium. The railroad men, faced with a unified front instead of a collection of vulnerable individuals, retreated. For now, the valley was safe. Summer deepened, the days long and hot, the plains a shimmering sea of green. Eliza's pregnancy advanced, her belly swelling with the new life she carried. As her time grew near, a quiet tension settled over the ranch. Samuel watched her with a hawk's eye, his happiness a fragile thing, perpetually shadowed by the memory of his loss. Every time she tired, every time she pressed a hand to her back, the old fear would rise up in him, cold and suffocating. He tried to hide it, but she saw it in his eyes. The labor began on a sweltering night in late August, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm. The midwife, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Gable, arrived from town. She sent Samuel out of the bedroom, telling him he was of no use but to boil water and stay out from underfoot. For Samuel, the hours that followed were a waking nightmare. He paced the main room of the house, every cry from behind the closed door, a knife twisting in his gut. The past and the present merged into a terrifying blur. He was back in this same house, in this same helpless agony, listening to the sounds of a life he loved fading away. He saw Sarah's face, pale and damp with sweat. He heard the weak, fluttering cry of his son, a sound that had grown fainter and then stopped altogether. He leaned against the rough log wall, his forehead pressed against the cool wood, and prayed with a desperation he had not felt in years. He prayed not to a distant, unfeeling God, but to Eliza. "Stay, please, stay with me." The storm broke just before dawn, a tremendous clash of thunder and a torrential downpour that washed the world clean. And then, from behind the door, came a new sound, not a cry of pain, but a strong, lusty wail, a baby's cry. The bedroom door opened. Mrs. Gable stood there, her round face tired but beaming. "You have a daughter, Mr. Granger, a healthy, beautiful daughter, and your wife is fine, resting. You can go in." He walked into the room as if in a dream. Eliza was propped up against the pillows, her face pale and exhausted, but her eyes were shining with a light that seemed to fill the room. She held a small, blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms. She looked up at him and smiled, a weary but triumphant smile. "Come and meet your daughter, Samuel," she whispered. He approached the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of the baby, the tuft of dark hair, the small, perfect hands. She was so small, so fragile, but she was alive. She was breathing. He reached out a trembling finger and stroked her cheek. Her eyes, the same deep, intelligent blue as her mother's, blinked open and stared up at him. Tears streamed down Samuel's face, hot and cleansing. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a grief finally, fully released. He was not replacing his son. He was adding to his family. This tiny, perfect child was not a ghost, but a promise, a future. He leaned down and kissed Eliza. A long, deep kiss, full of gratitude and a love so profound he had no words for it. In the new, rain-washed light of the dawn, their family had begun. They named her Abigail. Her presence transformed the ranch. The quiet, work-focused house was now filled with her cries, her gurgles, and eventually, her laughter. She was a constant, joyous presence, a living symbol of the valley's resilience. Jake Morrison, the stern foreman, would melt whenever she was near, carving her small wooden animals. Tom Bradley, the young cowboy, would sit on the porch for hours, letting her tiny fingers grasp his own calloused one. Life in the valley settled into a new kind of prosperity. The Stockmen's Association, having proven its strength, negotiated a lucrative contract to supply beef to the new railroad line that was now being built 10 miles to the south. Their cooperation had brought them not just security, but a shared wealth they could not have achieved alone. 2 years later, word came that Bill Hartley was dead. He had died in his sleep, a peaceful end for a man who had lived such a turbulent life. His son, Tommy, who had none of his father's grit or love for the land, decided to sell the Circle H. The threat of outside investors returned, but this time, the valley was ready. The association met, and using their collective funds, they bought the Circle H themselves. They divided the land fairly among the existing members, ensuring the valley would remain in the hands of the families who had worked it for generations. Samuel, as president, purchased a prime section of pasture land that bordered his own, the old Peterson Ranch, finally giving his growing herd the room it needed. The years flowed by, as steady and sure as the seasons. The love between Samuel and Eliza deepened, settling from the nervous uncertainty of its beginning into a solid bedrock partnership. They were more than husband and wife. They were, as Eliza had once called it, colleagues in life. Their days were a shared tapestry of work and family, of ranching and raising their daughter. One warm summer evening, Tom Bradley, no longer a boy but a confident young man, came to the house, his hat clutched in his hands, his face scrubbed and shining. He had come to ask for Samuel's permission to marry Jenny Peterson, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Samuel and Eliza gave their blessing with full hearts. Their own family was expanding, their community growing stronger, the next generation ready to take its place. Through it all, Jake Morrison remained, a quiet, steady presence, the moral compass of the ranch, a beloved uncle to young Abigail. The ranch was not just a piece of land. It was a legacy, a living thing being passed from one generation to the next. The wind at Cedar Creek still blew, a constant, restless presence that swept down from the high country. But it no longer sounded like the world's grief to Samuel Granger. Now, it was just the wind, the familiar sound of home. It was the sound of seasons changing, of years passing, of a life being lived. Many years had passed since the day Eliza Marlowe had stepped off the train with 17 cents in her pocket. Their daughter, Abigail, was now a young woman of 10. With her mother's sharp mind and her father's quiet strength, she was a child of the ranch, as comfortable on horseback as she was with a book, her laughter a constant, bright sound that echoed from the barn to the house. The empty silence that had once filled Samuel's life was a distant memory, a ghost long since laid to rest. Once a month, they would walk together, as a family, up the small hill behind the house where a grove of cottonwoods grew. 2 simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered by the sun and the wind. Samuel would stand before the graves of his first wife, Sarah, and their son, Daniel. He would tell them of the news of the ranch, of the growth of the herd, of Abigail's latest triumph at school. He spoke to them not as a man trapped in the past, but as a man sharing his present. The hill was no longer a border at the edge of his life, a place where his happiness ended. It was a part of the landscape of his heart, a place of memory, not of mourning. Eliza would stand beside him, her hand in his, and Abigail would lay a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the crosses. She knew the story of the woman and the little boy who had come before her. She knew she was not a replacement, but an addition. Love, she had learned from her parents, did not subtract. It multiplied. The valley had changed. The wild, isolated territory had become a state. The small, dusty town of Cedar Creek had grown, with a proper schoolhouse, a new church, and a dozen new businesses. The Stockmen's Association, born of desperation around the Granger's kitchen table, was now the most powerful political and economic force in the county. The men who had once been rivals were now partners, their families intertwined by marriage and friendship, and the shared understanding that their strength lay not in their individual fences, but in their collective will. They had learned, the hard way, to say way before I. The Granger Ranch itself had prospered. The original log house now had 2 new wings, built with timber from their own land. The herd was one of the largest in the valley. Tom Bradley, now a father of 2 himself, was Samuel's foreman, and Jake Morrison, his hair now more gray than brown, was still there, the respected elder statesman of the ranch, a permanent fixture in their lives. The work was still hard, the winters still long, but it was a good life, a solid life, built day by day, choice by choice. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows from the mountains across the plains, Samuel stood on his porch and looked out at the land. His land, their land. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods on the hill, a soft, peaceful sound. From inside the house, he could hear the low murmur of voices and the soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows. He stepped inside. The scene before him was one of simple, profound peace. The long years of struggle and heartache, of loss and rebuilding, had led to this quiet, ordinary moment. Eliza sat in her favorite chair by the fire, reading a book, her face serene and beautiful in the warm light. At the long wooden table, Abigail was meticulously building a small, intricate house out of wooden blocks, her brow furrowed in concentration. And Samuel sat down at his desk, opened his ledger, the same one Eliza had created for him all those years ago, and began to go over the week's accounts. The columns of numbers were not just figures. They were the story of a life rebuilt from its own broken pieces, a testament to a love that had arrived on a cold autumn wind and had chosen to stay. The house was warm. The lamp burned bright, and outside, the vast, wild country they had made their own lay sleeping under a blanket of stars. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.